Have you seen people who are really good but not brave enough?
Yes. In fact, many of us from time to time are not brave enough. Not all of us are brave enough all the time.
I always say that, you know, I wasn't born a genius, but I think really clearly, and I think that helps me very much. And so I think part of what I think you can help a student who's never been exposed to science or the scientific method is the biggest task is to clarify their thinking, try to make their thinking less cluttered, and you could actually see that happening.
It's maybe not a bad thing to be a slow processor. You don't have to be like lickety-split, fast on your feet, agile in the brain. You could be slow, steady like a tortoise and do okay.
Well, remember what Larry said, one thing at a time.
Right.
As part of the process, you change one thing at a time, and that requires a systematic approach, a clear thinking approach, an analytic approach. And you're right, it's very, very key.
I think what Larry was saying is if you're going to do this for a living, you have to do it with your whole heart.
Well, he did make the comparison between an artist and a scientist. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the same analogy that you're making, that you have to put your whole being into it. And I think that's true.
Did all three of you know that Gabe was heading for trouble? This is the woman of the group from the beginning of the film? Mm-hmm. What did you see that you...
That's hard to, okay.
That's embarrassing.
It is, it's a little bit hard to express, but yes, I sense that probably that she was the one that wasn't going to, that the thrill of the chase wasn't going to make her happy, that there were other things that were going to make her happier. The risk of being a scientist is sometimes very painful.
I wonder if she had been matched to a different type of project, if she might have had a different experience. And that gets back to the idea of, I say, that there really is a diversity of approaches to science. And when I'm working with a graduate student, you have to really have a feel for them and figure out what they would like and what they would be good at and what they need in order to be successful.
Did you smell a prejudice in this movie that seemed to say, without ever saying it, that real success is to become a professor, to go to academic science? And that if you get to work for a big pharmaceutical company as a scientist there, that's good. It's good. And if you end up playing soccer in the park, that's nice.
Well, she was smiling the widest at the end of the movie, wasn't she?
You're talking about being a graduate student in an academic setting. And that setting, in that setting, yeah, becoming a professor is sort of the end-all and be-all.
Well, I actually think that it's a misconception that the goal of science ever is to be a professor. The goal of science is to do science. It's to change the way we think about something. It's to invent, create, and indeed take us forward in the way we understand fundamental mechanisms. And I think that was the real success here. It was done in an academic setting. And it was the academic setting that was necessary to support this process. But the goal was to understand how this fundamental mechanism worked. And now we do, and that's a really, really wonderful contribution that they have made.
Well, it doesn't mean that you can't make tremendous contributions as a scientist in pharma or in biotech, and in fact, fantastic contributions have been made by scientists in industry.
I want to ask one other prejudice, and then I'll get to some of the public policy questions. There was a moment when Rob and Larry get to gaze at the protein, now actually seeing for the very first time what it really looks like, and even apparently finding the trigger that they were looking for. And they said, Rob says at one point, "I'm the first person in the world to see this." And I'm wondering, you have all had this experience at least once, maybe.
Yes, yes.
Is it way cool?
That is the most beautiful moment in science.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
I could, yeah, go ahead.
It's like you are the only one in the world that understands that thing at that moment. It's so beautiful.
Now, is that like being Magellan and saying, I am the first person on the shores of this continent
Yes.
that's white, or whatever? Or is it like Mozart, who just sits there and comes up with a tune that honestly belongs to him? See, the thing about what Rob was doing is that moment really didn't belong to him. He just happened to be the first tourist.
Maybe that's true of all of us, but still, the first tourist is the first tourist.
Like, yeah, they're singing my song. You know, if you're a composer and they're singing my song, I mean, this is something that I've discovered, right? And it doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, it's very exciting.
And that sense of ownership is extremely important to a lot of graduate students, and I think that's why you know, getting this incremental progress, when you get a finding, you start to take ownership of the project.
Is there something deeply creative about this? I'm not sure.
It's very creative.
It's very
creative.
It's all sorts of things rolled into one. I mean, it's competitive, you're hearing that, but it's incredibly creative. It is looking, it's not just seeing something for the first time, but understanding something in a new way. And it's not just to get to the top of the mountain. It is to understand this so that you can use this information for the better good. In this case, to understand obesity and diabetes, and to hopefully take this piece of information and then, as they talk about, move it into developing drugs that are actually going to help people. So it is not just a matter of being there first, although that's incredibly exciting, but it is what this means for the next step and ultimately to help people.
There's simply nothing else that I can do, and I'm driven to do this art form. And
I think that's what Larry said too.
And I think it might be different for other people. I wish I had such lofty views of wanting to help people understand the mechanism of diabetes. But I'm afraid I have to admit that I just want to discover the next process, and I just, regardless of whether it's important or not.
You hear a lot about, which is basic science, which is knowledge for knowledge's sake, which is incredibly important. And then there's knowledge for translation into the greater good.
I guess it's appropriate that I'm in the middle here, because I certainly love the thrill of discovery, and I'm also really in league with you in terms of that we're not doing scientists just to give ourselves rushes and thrills of discovery. It actually has a purpose in society, and this gets to the issue of broader impact, which is sort of something that I think a lot, at least of the scientists that I've been fortunate to work with, really have a very
I want to ask about impact, but go ahead.
And this really comes from having a diversity of perspectives in the laboratory. I mean, the idea of having a vaccine for AIDS the broad impact of that, besides saying, oh, I'm going to beat this virus as a game, the broad impact of coming up with a vaccine for AIDS really comes from people that you might know who might actually need it. Okay, and those kinds of, and people who might be consumers of what you're discovering actually being involved in the scientific process. And this is why a diversity of perspectives on science is so important.